Today we're taking a look at the newest release from Heaven Hill Distillery and the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch B525. Are they back in a big way, or are we in for a little bit more of the same? That we're going to talk about today on the My Bourbon Journey Whiskey Review channel. All right, welcome back everybody. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. So as always, a release that a lot of us are always anxious for and kind of is that highly anticipated release, 3 times a year. Now we're on to batch B525 of the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. And I think we're all in search of, kind of that next big boom. When is the next big one going to hit? We've been kind of in a little bit of a lull, I think, for the most part with the last maybe few batches, but hopefully today will change your mind. We're going to get into that a little bit. So before I give you some of the specs on the B525, what I did with this newest release is I actually left this in the glass overnight. Did some tasting notes yesterday on it. Wanted to see if this thing would open up and just kind of let it kind of do its thing. So I poured a little bit more in here today. So we'll see what some of that kind of translates to, and does that improve or enhance what it was that I was tasting yesterday. So without further ado, let's give you some of the specs here on the newest release, the B525. All right, so without further ado, let's give you guys some specs on what the B525 has to offer. So this one's coming in at 126.2 proof. Age on this is going to be 11 years, 6 months. So we're getting back to it being closer to that 12 years that we were used to going back, a couple years ago at this point. So again, standard mash bill, 78 corn, 10% rye, 12% malted barley. And again, MSRP, they've kept this thing the same for basically ever. $75 for the most part, that we've all become very accustomed to. And again, still, in my opinion, it's going to be a must buy. No matter what the profile is, it's always going to be a great bourbon. There just may be some that we feel are a little better than others. So with that being said, let's go ahead and kind of dive into this thing and give you guys an idea of what the B525 Elijah Craig Barrel Proof has to offer. All right, I see you here on this one. It feels already like we're significantly more improved than what we've been used to or accustomed to. Man, right away it has that old school, like old bourbon soaked barrel feel to it. Just that older wood kind of note to it without it being overly tannic at all. Man, beautiful, like rich kind of dark chocolates, almost and like an espresso type of note. Very, very rich so far. Now the fruit layers are interesting. As often as we're used to those heavy kind of Luxardo cherry, as much as that's there, this has much more of a kind of a refined fruit note. So when you start getting into some of those plums or blackberries, some of those heavy, rich kind of fruit notes, maybe like even a concentrated fruit note, you're kind of really picking up on some of that. A little bit of like a pastry note, like a glazed donut. There's a little bit of that kind of sweet, kind of vanilla glazed donut feel to it. Yeah, I just love that it's that concentrated feel. The nose, again, very much, I guess I'll say tried and true, but it already feels much richer and maybe even more complex on the nose than what I remember. And we'll get into the A125 as well later. Yeah, now here comes some of those kind of like burnt brown sugars. There's more of that when you kind of think of that campfire type of nose without it having that smoke note. There are barrel influences, but it's more of a richer sweet oak that's there, kind of compiled with a little bit of, again, that really nice dark chocolate note that's there. Yeah, but love again, that burnt brown sugar note that's there. Maybe even some slight toffee notes that are there as well. It's a very rich, and it feels like a very well-balanced nose. And I think, again, as we start to kind of get into, again, 11 years, 6 months, we know that's the minimum age of the bourbon, or the youngest bourbon within this blend. So we're already going to be introduced to some older bourbons within this blend. Yeah, it just has that very rich, decadent nose. Again, I think more that I kind of nose it, more of that kind of really nice Luxardo cherry comes out. I'll say this about the nuttiness that's there. There is a little hint of that, but I think the complex notes of everything else I've described are way overshadowing that altogether. But rather than kind of continue to dive into the nose, let's get into what this thing has to offer on the palate and see, are we really in for a big boom that we've all been waiting for with the B525. Cheers. Man, I feel like I could live in that like all day long. That is, even with the very first sip, a beautifully balanced Elijah Craig barrel proof. And I'll just go out on a limb and say this. I think just tasting that, it already feels better than any of the A, B, and C from 2024. It already has that almost everything you want, or that we've come to expect in the prior years. Again, everything that we've wanted from a great Elijah Craig barrel proof. But let's get into this a little bit more. Yeah, it just feels like we've gotten back to what it was that we all loved and what we expected from a great Elijah Craig barrel proof. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of them are always very, very good bourbons. This just has that elevated profile that I mentioned before that we were all kind of used to, and it feels like we've gotten back to that a little bit. Now, this feels like it's more close to that C923. I'm not going to compare it to that. I think that's a complete outlier for the most part. So far, we are spot on with this. I can't wait to kind of continue to dive into this thing a little bit more. That incredible Luxardo cherry fruit note that's there, maybe even like a kind of a cherry, or just even a pipe tobacco in general, that richness that's there. Incredible spice factor that this thing has to it. The more you sip on it, the more that starts to build and kind of linger on the palate. Really does a lot of sitting on the mid to the back of the palate. Again, mouthfeel, I'm gonna say it's pretty thick, fairly creamy, mouth coating. All of that's going to really help with this flavor profile continue to kind of build. So, I mean, it's got a lot of just incredible flavors so far. You know, I had mentioned the oak factor on the nose, and it has all of those just really rich characteristics that you want from an ECBP, that rich, sweet oak that you kind of expect without any of those real kind of heavy tannic notes that oftentimes you can get from some older whiskeys. This has just a beautiful balance, you know, with the fruit, the spice, the chocolate, just everything that kind of continues to build is going right back to, or bringing me right back to where I wanted to be, and kind of enjoying those older Elijah Craig barrel proofs. It just feels like that the barrel interaction with these blended bourbons just kind of works, I mean, so extremely well with the spice, you know, the chocolate notes, again, more of that cherry pipe tobacco, that Luxardo cherry that I mentioned before. This just is more elevated. It's more of that, getting back to that elegant kind of whiskey that we all kind of loved before, that we kind of feel like we've been missing a little bit of. So, man, this is a really nice start to maybe feeling like we're getting back to the roots of what Elijah Craig barrel proof kind of used to represent for a lot of us. Yeah, also, I don't know if it's quite drinking at its proof point, that 126.2 proof. I mean, that's fairly hefty. And one thing I'm not really focusing on all that much is big, heavy proof. There's a lot of flavor, really nice long finish for the most part that this has, but just all of those individual flavors throughout this thing just kind of continue to build. And it really feels like, again, one of those ECBPs that we all really used to kind of enjoy back in the day, you know, when they were at that 12 years and above. This feels much more in line with that than it does some of the more kind of recent releases. Yeah, the more you kind of continue to sip on this, and having that beautiful oak always kind of present, along with, you know, again, that spice, a lot of the burnt brown sugars, and some of that espresso, some of the cherry, like Luxardo cherry, cherry pipe tobacco notes. You know, all of the ECBPs kind of have those characteristics. There's just the ones that feel a little bit more like well done. Like some of them feel like they have some older whiskeys in them that are allowing for that complexity to kind of build and really kind of, you know, show itself, you know, in the whiskey. And this really feels like it's kind of falling into that. Those burnt brown sugars kind of continue to linger. Again, I love the chocolate note that's on this. It has a little bit of that kind of cherry cordial feel to it. You know, you do still get some of those, of course, you know, vanillas and caramels, which is, you know, kind of a classic thing with Elijah Craig. But, you know, glazed donut, like I mentioned on the nose, there are those like enhancers that just kind of continue to build and layer on each thing that it is you're tasting. So this starts to get into that category of it being like a great whiskey. Just to sit down and sip on this feels like as tried and true and as classic of an older ECBP that I can remember, you know, even in the last, let's say, handful of releases, you know, going all the way back to that C923 when you got a lot of those. This feels like it's, again, closer to that than it does to, again, some of the more recent ones. But let's do this. Let's compare the B525 with the A125. Let's see what kind of improvements, you know, in my opinion, there have been with this new release. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this. Let's do a little comparison of the A125 with the newest release B525 and see exactly what, you know, these kind of have in common, if really anything. So we'll kind of nose it really quickly and then get into a taste. Yeah, see, this just doesn't have nearly as much. As good as this is, it just doesn't have that big richness, that complexity that the B525 has. You know, you get a lot of the same kind of characteristics. This just doesn't feel as well, you know, balanced for the most part. So, all right, let's taste this one. Cheers. So my first thought immediately is much more of a nutty characteristic on the A125 than I was getting on the B525. This, again, like I had referenced before, feels much more in line with C923 and those really rich, heavy, you know, big, bold bourbon notes that we, again, were accustomed to in some of the prior you know, ECBPs. This, again, has still a beautiful profile to it, but much more nuttiness. Not quite or really even close to the complexity that this has. Like, I think the B525 feels like it could be one of those whiskeys that fall within that, you know, bourbon of the year in 2025 kind of feel. It just has that richness. Like when I'm looking at this and this has a little bit more of this kind of cloudy look to it versus this looking a little bit thinner. Still a beautiful whiskey, but this has that thickness, that decadence, you know, that we, again, have all, you know, been kind of searching for with the ECBP. So let's dive into this thing a little bit more. So in comparison, the B525 is significantly more improved. Again, another year approximately in age that's now been added to this. But overall, it's just not for me much of a comparison. As much as I enjoy this 4 times as much. All right, so let's give you some of my final thoughts here on the B525. One more sip and we'll give you kind of all the good things. Yeah, beautiful oak, that sweet, rich oak that I love in a bourbon. Spice factor is great, mouthfeel fantastic, pretty creamy for the most part. The one thing that I mentioned before, that proof point, it's there, but it doesn't feel like it's quite 126.2 proof on that one. But again, the chocolate layer, a little bit more of that campfire without the smokiness that's there. There's just that richness, that big, bold kind of characteristic that we all love, in an ECBP. So for me, from a buy standpoint, I feel like this is the strongest buy recommendation since the C923 release. Again, I think this is better than any of the 2024s. Again, I've not done a comparison with those yet, but I just, in remembering back to kind of tasting through some of those, this feels much more elevated than some of those 2024 releases. So again, it's a buy recommendation for me. I think, again, this just falls into that category of the ECBPs that we all kind of came to love, back 2-3 years ago, where it has really some age behind it. It has that everything we kind of wanted from ECBPs, in the past. For a lot of people, there were some that were kind of turned off, by some of them. I think this may be, again, one of the newer batches that maybe kind of lights that fire for a lot of people. So I'll be interested to hear your feedback. Once you kind of get into these, or this one specifically, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That is the most important thing, is are we kind of back in a big way with the B525 here? So with that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Greatly appreciate it as always. If you'd like to follow me, you can on Facebook and Instagram, those places at My Bourbon Journey. If you'd like to help support the channel and become part of the Mash and Journey Whiskey Club, you can through my Patreon link in the description below. That down there with a lot of other great things for you as well. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. And as always, it's about the journey and not the destination. Cheers. We'll see you next time.
I've been feeling myself. I've been trying to keep it all on track. I can tell you took your time. I've been thumbing through your gram like that. Bring my energy back. Girl, you're something like the sunlight. Girl, you're something like the sunshine.